So a few months back I watched Loki, hyping myself up as each episode released week by week, and during that time I thought it was a great weekly mystery and an interesting story to follow. However, having gone back and rewatched the whole thing in order to make this review, that opinion has changed somewhat. More of the finer details of the episodes sticking with me instead of fading by the time the next episode airs. Out of the 3 shows that Marvel has produced so far, it was definitely the one that I felt kept its steam the longest, only falling off towards the end instead of around the middle point with WandaVision, which I believe led many to have a lot of misgivings with the show as a whole. And Falcon, while enjoyable at times, had character motivations so scattered apart it felt like I was a child in a Fazbear pizzeria. Trust me bro, they aren't terrorists, they're just misunderstood. Who knows why they bombed that orphanage and are instigating mass panic. As much of an MCU junkie as I claim to be, I can still look at the content being produced under a critical lens and see where the shortcomings lie. I'm still hoping that Marvel will produce a show that has some real staying power. While the ones produced so far have setups or information that will keep them semi-relevant until an eventual payoff in a later film, not one of them I believe so far can stand the test of time on the back of its own merits, preferring rather to use the backdrop of the MCU as a supporting crutch rather than build itself wholly from the ground up. That brings us to Loki. The first 2 episodes of this show had some really decent setup, following on immediately after Loki's escape in Endgame, getting us briefly up to speed with when the show is taking place, to quickly bring us into something new and interesting. The information on the variant that's causing problems, as well as discovering their way of hiding out in any timeline that is cut short by a world-ending apocalypse, thus not triggering any deviations for the TVA, is actually quite clever. However, when you break them down, these opening episodes are just overly long setup for how the TVA works, featuring several different explanations on how the concept of time travel works within the MCU as a whole. Loki himself does get some standout moments to shine during this opening segment, in what I personally like to call, "Hey babe, it's 4 AM, time to speedrun your character development," in which Loki gets a brief summary of the other MCU movies he's been in. Seeing his reaction to the decisions he has yet to make, and watching him tear up at his own death scene did leave a lasting impression. Tom Hiddleston has never disappointed with his acting as Loki, and it's the same this time around as well. Despite his name being on the poster, however, Loki is not the protagonist of Loki. Loki is. And this Loki teams up with the other Loki, and they end up coming face to face with some more Lokis. Okay, I'll stop. But it's true that the show isn't actually about Loki himself. He's actually more of a supporting character in this show. No, Loki is more so about setting up the TVA, its failures and dealings in the multiverse's timeline, as well as setting up the future implications that this organization could bring to the MCU as a whole. Going back to talk about Loki's character, it's an interesting step that they're trying to take this character in. The show starts mere seconds after he escapes during the events of Avengers Endgame, meaning that the Loki we are presented with is the same one that was dealt with back in 2012's Avengers.
Not until I make him kill you. Slowly, intimately, in every way he knows you fear.
And yet his characterization in the show wants to follow the Loki that was shown in Ragnarok, a more laid-back character. Still not a good person, more chaotic neutral than anything overly malicious. Now this would be a good place to end with the changes, right?
Wrong.
I can't quite put my finger on why I feel the show seems to have reduced Loki's intelligence somewhat. The most egregious showing of this is during episode 3, Lamentis. For a character whose entire getup is about stealth and covert actions, it feels somewhat disingenuous that he proceeds to get completely drunk and bring so much attention to himself, especially when the guards were wary of him in the first place. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed hearing Tom Hiddleston singing, and the conversations between Sylvie and Loki were genuinely emotional and had a lot of character development in them. Bringing these characters closer together and getting the audience invested in seeing how this story will play out. But then they're thrown off a train. You keep waiting for the reveal of how it was all according to Cake, but no, that's just what happens and the story continues from there. Episode 4 was when the show really kicked up its rating. It's at that point that it starts to raise several questions about who is actually in charge and who's pulling the strings behind the scenes, making a lot of the TVA scenes have this previously non-existent underlying sense of dread and foreboding, which is then escalated in episode 5, which is a standalone episode I rate the best episode of the series so far. The interactions between the dozens of Lokis was genuinely hilarious. The setting of the end of time being this rundown wasteland that's slowly being being devoured hits the post-apocalyptic vibe right on the head for me, and the overall tone of this episode is exactly what you'd expect from something that has numerous Lokis in it. It's full of witty remarks and genuinely funny backstabbing. The variants that our main Loki meets, those being boastful, old, alligator, and child Loki, are all likable characters in their own right. The relationships with Sylvie and Mobius are very well defined by this point in the story, and the stakes and overall threat are very high and believable. Old Loki's sacrifice I thought was very poignant, offering us all an insight into what Loki could have been like had the circumstances been different. A sad, old, regret-filled man who never got to see his family again because he hid himself away after Thanos' attack at the start of Infinity War. He got his golden moment to shine towards the end of this episode, and I enjoyed it a lot. Episode 6, in my opinion, probably stands to be the most decisive episode of the series. It's a much better finale than WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldiers, but like its predecessors, it does fall short in several areas. While being an amazing episode in terms of setup and potential future payoff, when you look at it from an outside perspective, the majority of this episode is spent sitting around talking, with a fight scene thrown in at the end. Jonathan Majors does a great job as He Who Remains. He's got an air about him that is full of mystery, that entices you to see where they're going to take this character going forward. But within this episode alone, he plays with some clay, tells the audience 30 minutes of exposition about everything that's happened and may potentially happen, before teasing the future of the MCU as a whole. It doesn't exactly feel climactic, more like setup, which makes sense due to Loki already being confirmed to be getting a season 2. Now it's set up for something really unique and interesting, but it's still set up at the end of the day, feeling rather similar to the other Marvel movies that take a similar approach. Season 2 of Loki does seem to be getting some interesting developments though, and while I personally will be watching it to keep up to date on the MCU, I feel like something needs to be done to really sell the relationship between Loki and Sylvie, if this is something they want to develop going forward. It definitely has its moments in Season 1, but it would need to be focused on more to actually sell that these two characters are falling for each other. Creating a blanket of the occasional look isn't quite enough to distract from the fact that you are technically falling in love with yourself. Mobius's quest to take down the TVA, however, has the potential to be a fantastic storyline if done correctly, and I believe if they focus on these stories specifically rather than spending too much time on further setup, it could very well be an improvement over the first season. Overall, I feel the first season of Loki did a good job. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. It would be a 6 out of 10 if we're going off just the story and pacing, but Tom Hiddleston and Sophie DiMartino's backs really pulled through and carried this entire performance. But that's all for this video. I've been Nefri, and I will see you all in the next one.